Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Erin Cortus, who is an associate professor at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Bioproducts and Biosystems Engineering. Erin, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you on today. Erin, if you wouldn't mind giving our audience just a little bit more background about who you are and where your interests are currently, that would be very helpful.
Sure. I work at the University of Minnesota in Bioproducts, Biosystems Engineering in both a research and an extension capacity. And the work that I do really focuses on that livestock environment, generally inside the barn, but then, of course, what happens inside the barn influences what happens around the barn. I came here I was born and raised in Saskatchewan, Canada, worked at the Prairie Swine Center, and it was really just in grad school or undergrad and grad school where I got my introduction to intensive livestock production. And it's stayed with me. I found the world fascinating. As I was working in the barn in my initial years as an undergrad and working on some research projects at that farm, I recognized that as an engineer in what I was learning and what I was doing, I had this opportunity to influence the animals, the workers in a barn, the surrounding environment, the surrounding community, and so it just felt so holistic that, one action could influence so many things, so many people. And that's why I've stuck with it for so long.
Sure. Well, and you bring up an interesting point. So you use the word sustainability, and I think that as we were visiting before we started the podcast, it would be a really good thing to do is maybe just start with, how do you define the sustainability?
I think it's, first of all, important to recognize that there is no one definition for sustainability, because sustainability goals, sustainability, or what that means, is meant to be very personal, either to an individual or an organization. But when we look at goals across this big spectrum of individuals and organizations, there are generally some common elements to that, and that it harkens back to making decisions, considering economics, considering environment, and considering society in general around an operation, around a person, around a decision.
Very good point. And certainly, even when we just get into natural resources, depending on where you're at, different resources are going to be defined more for sustainability versus others, such as water or soil, or et cetera.
Yeah, that's one of these huge challenges with sustainability, is that sustainability encompasses so many different potential impacts, potential resources as part of that conversation. And it's really just through those sustainability goals that it really illuminates, what are some of the priorities for a given individual, a given institution, a given operation. Because, right, like I said, they're very personal, and it needs to consider, both your local surroundings and what's within your capacity.
Sure, very good. So let's talk a little bit about what you currently do. So as you describe yourself, you're kind of a translator almost between what's going on in the research world and how we apply it into more of a practical manner. So how do you do some of that communication?
Right. My background and my training has been on the environmental side of livestock production. My research has typically focused on air emissions from livestock systems of all types, and potentially ways that we can influence that, but it also has considered manure management and then some of these communication aspects that come along with environment. And so I tend to focus on environmental sustainability decisions or environmental stewardship in general, but much of what I do, or sustainability, encompasses environment, but it encompasses a lot of different things. And so there is this whole world of sustainability. There is this whole science to sustainability, or to making sustainability metrics, or calculating sustainability metrics, I should say. There is a whole science. There's a department or there's a major, in my department that focuses on that. But I feel that there's a different perspective and a different approach in that science compared to what people are implementing on farm. and can implement on farm or could implement on farm. And what I'm trying to do in my work now is bridge those connections. You know, how can we talk between, let's say, global impacts and life cycle analyses, and how can we talk how can we bring those conversations to our decision making on farm, but also how can we influence that conversation at the global level by what is possible and why are decisions made the way they are on farm.
That's very good. When you're talking to a farmer, and you use the word sustainability and you start this conversation, what are the common questions or concerns that you hear from them?
In a past project with some of my colleagues here at the University of Minnesota, as well as the University of Nebraska, we actually talked to quite a few swine producers about carbon footprints in specifically, but you know, they filter into this conversation on sustainability. Anyway, as part of that conversation, you know, we asked, well, what is your interest in carbon footprints in this case? And the overwhelming response is that we want to do the right thing. You know, we want to make decisions, good decisions. And so that was evident across everyone we talked to. And that's frankly evident with the other species that I work with as well. But I think that how we get there or how we make those decisions or what we base those decisions on is still a little ambiguous in people's minds. And rightfully so, it's still ambiguous in my mind most of the time too. But you know, I think it then comes down to different perspectives as to what people view as sustainable, what different people view as their goals for sustainability. And so I think first part of the conversation is you know, recognizing what does sustainability look like for different people and different perspectives.
One of the things that tends to pop into my mind too, when we talk to producers, is, you know, obviously we're already focused on being good stewards of land. Land stewardship has been a long conversation. Water stewardship, of course, as well. And so we look at, okay, well, wine industry in particular, if we look at where we are today versus where we were 20 years ago, we use a lot less land, a lot less natural resources to provide the same amount of meat, or more meat actually, than what we used to do. So what's the next step, right? So I look at it and go, okay, they're already doing this. We've obviously changed our genetics, our ventilation, our health, our nutrition programs. What's the next step? Do you ever hear that conversation and have people ask you that?
So I think that next step comes down to some of those priorities, you know, and where you're focusing. You know, if by sustainability, environmental sustainability, you know, you're shooting to impact some of these global metrics like global warming potential. You know, I think the first step is first understanding where it comes from on a farm, and really that scope that go into some of those calculations. This is where that sustainability science comes in. That science includes life cycle analyses. You know, they put scopes, they put boundaries to their calculations. And I think they're often different boundaries than what we consider as our farm boundary, you know, as our barn boundary. So how do people start this action, right? Or these actions towards sustainability? It is about understanding where you are and where you want to be. And where you want to be, you know, might be just based on your own personal goals. They might be somewhat guided by industry goals. You know, this is where we want to be. I think the pork board uses the word North Star. This is the North Star of where we want to be in the future. And so based on where you want to be, you know, I think the first step is just understanding where you are and what resources you have at your disposal, and really frankly your situation. If we liken it and make the analogy to charting a course on the map, you know, and start embarking on a road trip across the country, well, you need to know where you're starting from, and you also need to know what you have at your disposal to get to where you're going to go. And so, you know, if we're trying to understand where we're at, I think it is about, diving a little bit deeper into using some of the calculators, some of the tools that are available to try and make these baseline estimates of where we're at. If the priority is, to contribute to carbon neutrality or to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, where are the greenhouse gas emissions coming from? That was, I think, an illuminating point with some of the producers we worked with. The tools that are available, the calculators that are out there, they're designed with a specific boundary in mind. And in many cases, that goes back to the feed production side. And I think it was a very big aha moment in many cases that, for a carbon footprint, what we call a cradle to gate footprint, the majority, almost half the estimated emissions come from feed production and the other half from manure. Our on-farm energy use, which is what I think a lot of people turn to as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for a cradle to gate footprint, is a small proportion. But it's also a big proportion of what a farmer has control over. So it's some of these decisions that can guide, or some of these actions, excuse me, that can guide the next step.
I think that brings up a very interesting point, actually a couple of different points for me. One, if I have people who are listening, what are some calculators that you might recommend that they use, or is there a consultant that they should be looking for to help them kind of walk through that process of identifying carbon emissions? Because I do believe at some point we're going to have some statement about our carbon footprint on our products or as we market out, to the industry.
The National Pork Board did have an environmental footprint calculator, but they're in the process of rejuvenating that, making some improvements to it based on what we have learned over the last several years of using it. There are other calculators that are specific to crop production. Per se, there's a field to market tool that really focuses on that land production side. There's another one that's called Cool Farm, and those are just touching the surface of what's probably out there, considering worldwide tools. What I think is somewhat lacking, though, are tools that really help us look at integrated crop and livestock production, and that circling back and that recycling of nutrients. It's there in different ways on both the livestock specific calculators and the crop production specific calculators, but I do hope to see more integration of those calculations in the future. That's not to say every farm includes livestock and every farm includes crop production. There are distinct entities in both those situations. But I think if we move towards ways to do some more of that integrated modeling, I think it's going to forge more communication too between our different agricultural sectors, and more partnerships, and hopefully move folks and industries along together.
And that's actually a very interesting point when we think about that conversation, right? So I've heard some production groups say, we're carbon neutral. Obviously, if we go read the paper, we'll hear agriculture is really bad in terms of carbon emissions, and we tend to miss the carbon capture side of the equation in some of the communication that's occurring. And so how do we help bridge that integration gap? Because you're absolutely right. In agriculture, we have some producers that are diversified and they have both. And so for them, they can use the calculations pretty easily. We have others who are buying in their crops. And so, we don't want to double count anything from a carbon capture perspective, but we also don't want to be penalized because we're missing that piece. Does that make sense?
It does. And like I said, I'm not the foremost expert on all the different LCAs and different approaches there, but from what I've seen in the calculators, it's actually that integrated farm where I think we're maybe not providing enough resources or the right type of tool to account for that cycling. Within the crop production estimates, they tend to pull in estimates based on how much is manure or how much land receives manure or fertilizer, and whether those proportions are entered manually or automatically. I think that's a function of the calculator, or that's one of those background things in the calculator to understand. And then how that applies downstream. And so I think it's actually that cycling part for integrated systems that we're perhaps not capturing as well as we potentially could.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I heard you say a couple of times, or you talk about metrics. And so carbon, I agree, the calculators give us some really nice metrics, and we can say, okay, this is how much we're using to, apply for ground application and so forth. But I'm going to flip gears a little bit on you. And you mentioned it, a lot of your work was on air emissions. And while we think sustainability is associated with natural resources, there are other portions to that, such as air quality. So in some of my recent conversations and work, we've kind of struggled, honestly, with coming up with a good metric to really measure air quality. So do you have any thoughts on metrics? Because to me, it seems like we still struggle to always have the correct metrics to say, yes, this is what's important, or this is what's critical.
Oh, very much so. Air emission monitoring is very challenging. It's very expensive. It's very time consuming. And so it's not something that we can, at this point in time, really do on every farm, for every scenario, for every situation. And so we're forced to fall back onto some more generalized models, some generalized equations. And I think that, in a way, is a bit of a rub, because do these emission estimates really reflect what I'm doing and all the decisions that I'm making on a farm? And it's actually a point in some of my ongoing research right now is there a way that we can fine tune some of those estimates for individual farms to help estimate greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from manure? I guess that's where I'm trying to focus, at the manure storage level. But I think the same could be said for land application. I think we know, what can happen with some different land application processes and incorporation and tillage, but we do lack, I think, we don't have a sensor that measures emission directly. We have to rely on a series of different measurements in order to put together an emission value. And so we're missing that as far as a technology, really, to help us along this pathway. But I think there are some indicators, and like I said, that's what I'm working on right now. And hopefully, in a couple of years, I can provide a little bit more guidance as to what maybe some of those are.
Oh, we look forward to that for sure. The other question that came to mind when we think about it, when we talk across groups, right? So as swine producers, we have our own set of terminology, and certainly when we communicate to our consumer, they may not understand the same terms. And you mentioned it earlier, the worldwide metrics and guidance versus what we can do at the local level. What disconnect do we have? Are there different metrics that the worldwide group is viewing that maybe our producers can't really do, and vice versa, that we are being sustainable, but it's not being measured appropriately?
A lot of it, I think, comes down to the impacts, looking at global impacts versus local damages. I've heard it explained as an impact spectrum, going from global dangers to regional problems to, like I said, local dangers. And I think the local dangers are really what are more tangible on farm, and regardless of what's happening at the globe, it's something. If there's a damage locally, we want to fix it. And I'm not just talking about environment, right? Just for any particular sustainability realm. But then at the global level, they use a different set of terms. They use a different set of terms within their life cycle analyses, or within the life cycle analyses that are done. And I think there are linkages, but there is no one direct link between every local damage and a global global danger. But recognizing the partial links might be part of that conversation or building that conversation. So I think that there is this literacy behind sustainability that, building our personal dictionaries, word banks when it comes to these conversations. We can't expect everybody to meet. I don't think we can expect everybody to meet a farmer where a farmer is at, but we can't expect either a farmer to meet everybody at the global level. And so bridging that communication is part of this translation job, and building some of that literacy in both directions.
Very good. My last question to you is, if I'm a producer listening to this podcast today, what are a couple of things that I can do today or tomorrow to help myself with sustainability, and even to maybe bridge some of this gap in translation that we're needing to fix?
So a very big picture item that I think has potential to move us forward in communication and communicating sustainability is using sustainability as an adjective for actions versus an adjective for beings. I think we, because sustainability goals are ever changing, and they should be ever changing as we learn more and as technologies change, sustainability goals change. And so I think we need to, I think we should focus on using sustainability as an adjective for actions, trying to make sustainable decisions, or decisions that improve some specific sustainability metrics, versus all out statements of being or not being sustainable. And so I think that's one way to perhaps bridge some conversations, or, even react to some conversations as well. I think then also, particularly as it comes to the environment, since sustainability is such a broad goal, if there really is a focus or in a conversation or in some actions specific to the environment, I consider moving away from sustainability as a very general word and talking about environmental stewardship, because within all of these decisions, our environment is so broad, encompassing so many different resources and so many potential impacts. Every decision, is going to have pluses and minuses, or benefits and consequences. And environmental stewardship is about being responsible for your decisions and knowing the impacts, because every decision is not going to move the bar down or up, depending on which direction it's supposed to move. Every one decision is going to have benefits, but it's also going to have consequences. And so talking about sustainability, environmental sustainability, and transferring that conversation to stewardship and just being responsible for those choices, I think is another way to move conversations.
Very good. Well, as we start to wrap up our time here, Erin, we tend to ask our speakers a couple of different questions. The first one we like to ask is, do you have any resources that you would recommend to our audience associated with pigs, or in this case, sustainability, that you think would be valuable for them?
I think finding a calculator that you're comfortable using, or maybe roping in a family member to maybe be your sustainability manager, to run those types of calculators or those tools, I think is a way to, is a resource. Those are resources that are out there, but it's also then a way to tie in more people into this conversation, even within a farm. I also, I've enjoyed learning about systems thinking in my career, and going down some different learning paths as it comes to systems thinking. But there are some I think good guides on what that means, and I think it gives a different perspective as to how we can both look at our actions as they relate to sustainability, or what actions that we could or should take, but then also especially on this communication side, and how we can break systems into parts, or talk about parts as part of a system. I think that's it's a valuable resource and a valuable exercise.
Are there any books out there that would help producers maybe understand terminology, expectations to start to help bridge that gap? Are there any books or even a website that might work for that?
I'll be honest, I am looking for that golden book myself.
Okay.
That has it, has all these terms, has all these definitions in one place. I'm still looking myself, especially as it pertains to agriculture. And I think we can look for dictionaries that have sustainability terms, but we then would still need the complementary dictionary for all the farm terms. And so
Great.
So I'm trying to build a translator.
I'd say that should be your next activity, right?
Yeah,
Write a book.
Growing up in Canada, we had to learn French, and so we had a French-English dictionary all the time in school, and so we need that translator book.
Absolutely. Well, we'll look forward to you writing that book in the next year. How's that?
Wish me luck.
The other question we like to ask is not related necessarily to your work or to swine in general, but are there any good books that you're reading today that you'd recommend to our audience, or self-improvement books that you've enjoyed reading?
A couple of the more recent books that I've been reading and that I think have helped shape some of my actions as it pertains to this sustainability question and sustainability communication. One is called Getting to the Heart of Communication, Getting to the Heart of Science Communication, I believe it's called. And it's broader than just talking about climate change. It's really about how, particularly from an extension perspective, we can bridge some difficult conversations. I think these sustainability conversations can can take political nuances to them and can be difficult to have, especially if we're talking about beings and actions and mixing up some of those things. And so I think getting at the heart of the communication aspect has been a valuable resource and learning experience for me. And then the other one is called Systems Thinking Made Simple, I believe, by the 𝘸𝗶𝗵. And again, it's really a simplistic take as to how to look at systems using a couple of simple rules.
Oh, very good. We'll look into those books. I haven't read either one of them, so definitely check those out. Our last question that we ask is, if you think of somebody in your career, your professional interactions that you view as successful, what's a trait or two that stands out in your mind that's really helped them become successful?
There's three people that I look at as mentors for myself in the career that I've taken. And they were Steve Pohl, Bob Toller, and 𝘸𝑩𝑦𝑡𝑡𝑦. And all three have provided innumerable guidance as I've moved through my career. Steve and Bob, especially on the extension perspective and understanding, listening more than talking when it comes to working with producers and extension audiences. And then Kevin has been just an excellent guide as to how to really about managing and moving forward and figuring out how to look at all the various tasks that have to be done and setting them up for success and a step at a time, but still moving forward.
Very good. Perfect. Well, I do want to thank you again for your time, Erin. For our audience, again, this is Dr. Erin Cortus, who is at the University of Minnesota. Thank you again, and I wish you a great day.
Thank you, Laura.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.